Hi, my name is Robert Hess, and this is my freshman exit project video analysis. And I did this on Spider-Man. And what this project is I analyzed the three live-action adaptation versions of Spider-Man, how they compare to each other, and to the source material, which are the Marvel comics. So let's get started. And just a warning that there are spoilers for Spider-Man No Way Home in this video. Um, Spider Man has been without a doubt one of the most well liked and most famous fictional characters of all time. The character has had a significant cultural impact over the years since his first appearance in 1962. I'm not going to get into the character's entire history, but the big thing is that he was created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko and made his first appearance in Amazing Fantasy number 15, which remains one of the most valuable comic books of all time. The reason Spider Man was such a hit, you see, was not because of his superpowers or abilities, but for his stories and character. Spider Man was the first mainstream superhero that was a teenager and had real world personal problems. Audiences could relate to the character more than any other superhero. Of course, when there is a character as iconic as Spider Man, there would be many adaptations of the character in both animation and live action. The three live action adaptations of the character were Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and Tom Holland. And I'm going to analyze the similarities and differences between those adaptations and how they compare to the original source material, like I just said. So first off is Tobey Maguire. Tobey Spider-Man was the introduction of the character to many non-comic audiences. Sam Raimi, the director, had the responsibility of bringing this character to the live action and remaining true to the comics, which he did for the most part. To many people, Tobey was and still is the definitive Spider-Man. Raimi did a fantastic job at portraying the character and his stories from the comics in an accurate representation on the big screen. There are a few slight differences, though, between the comics and Tobey's iteration of the character. And I'm not just talking about like small things like his web shooters or Sandman being his uncle's killer. I'm talking about the way his character is portrayed. And you'll find that Tobey's character is very accurate to the comics, but have a few notable differences, much like the other two live action adaptations. So Tobey's Peter does a great job at showing his nerdy and shy qualities, which are the most essential aspects of Peter Parker. But when he puts on the mask, he almost seems to be the same person when he is not wearing the suit. And what I mean by that is he still shows shy and nerdy qualities when he is wearing the suit, which is something essential about his character, but it's kind of a notable difference from his comic counterpart. When Peter puts on the mask in the comics, he almost becomes an entirely different person. He cracks jokes and he becomes a lot more confident, which is very different from when we see Peter with what we see him deal with in his everyday life. Now, this change is not necessarily a bad thing when considered in the Raimi movies. Raimi focuses more on quote unquote the heart of the story, for a lack of a better term, and a few of these adjustments are made to fit the overall structure of the story in which Raimi is telling. Now, if you were to ask me like 5 months ago what exactly sets Tobey's Peter apart from the other two, I would have said that the impact that being Spider Man sets on Tobey's Peter is far more significant, and that impact is far greater than that of Andrew and Tom. However, my views have kind of changed on that with the release of Spider-Man No Way Home, and I will get into that a little later in the video. But regardless of the deviation from the comics, Tobey Spider-Man still remains an iconic to many people, including myself to this day. Next up is Andrew Garfield. And right off the bat, I have to admit that Andrew Spider Man is probably my least favorite adaptation of the character in any form of media. In my opinion, his movies aren't really that great, and there are too many deviations from the source material that it almost feels like the main character isn't even Spider Man. But despite this, Andrew Spidey still has a soft spot in my heart, and there are aspects of his Spider Man that I'm really fond of that I will get into. But before I continue, please consider that I will try my best to remove any bias or criticism from my opinions of Andrew Spider-Man, and I will look at what makes his character unique and different from the other adaptations. So you're welcome to take my analysis with a bit of a grain of salt. But I talked about how the quality of confidence from Tobey was taken away in his movies, and it feels like the opposite occurs with Andrew's portrayal of the wall crawler, and I'll try my best to explain this. So instead of not being confident, he doesn't seem very nerdy or shy, which is an aspect of the character that is important. And this occurs when he's not Spider-Man, but when he is Peter Parker. And while I don't mind the changes for Tobey's character, especially when considering the circumstances of the story, I don't necessarily feel the same way about Andrew. He still feels like Peter Parker in a suit instead of an almost entirely different character when he is Spider-Man. Now, why am I bringing this up? And why am I discussing my own opinions or criticisms when I'm analyzing this version? Well, this is because this is exactly what sets him apart from Toby and even Tom at times. These changes for Andrew do work a lot for some people, and that is great. But despite how I feel about this, I admire how the characters took a different approach with Andrew Spider-Man. It doesn't feel like Toby 2.0, but it also kind of stands out from the comics as well. And Andrew Spider-Man did something that really no other iteration of the character did, and that is making him so incredibly unique that he feels like his own character, and he isn't just another attempt at replicating what is in the comics. I actually keep an open mind when I consider Andrew's Spider-Man. I have learned to embrace the differences and accept what makes his character so special, even if I may not entirely agree with the way it is portrayed at times. I'll try to give an example of something unique that I actually like right now, and I would say that that is the way he interacts with the people around him, especially kids. It just feels so special and so human, and that is the thing that I always appreciate about his Spider-Man. Little moments like when he saves a kid from a burning car by giving him his mask to give him a sense of confidence, or walking a kid home that was just bullied, and a few things that make Andrew Spider-Man really special. Those are a few things that make his Spider-Man really special and sets him apart from the other Spideys as well. Now, last up is Tom, and I will say that Tom is actually my favorite live-action adaptation of Spider-Man. Tom has what is best of Tobey's Spider-Man and Andrew's Spider-Man, and and I always thought that Tobey has the best Peter and Andrew has the best Spidey, but Tom does an incredible job at combining those traits, which are some of his most essential traits from the comics. Spider-Man is unique because he can actually interact with other Marvel characters within the MCU, which is something that Tobey and Andrew could not do until No Way Home. Not only can he interact with them, but the other characters can actually contribute to his character's growth as well. For example, Iron Man. Iron Man acts as a mentor to Tom's Peter, and this kind of compares to the role that Mr. Fantastic and at times the Human Torch did in the early Lee Ditko storylines. And understandably, there are many criticisms to the relationship between Stark and Peter, but I think that those people are kind of missing the real world representation on how the growth and the transition of a boy to a man can occur. So when you look at Tom's Spider-Man trilogy, you can see that this transition is slowly portrayed in the entirety of his trilogy. So it's almost like instead of retelling the classic origin story, they instead make an origin trilogy, but I don't like to think of it that way. Each movie is a step in his growth into adulthood. Homecoming shows how he wants to pursue a career in the Avengers, which in the early Lee Ditko storylines, it was the Fantastic Four and the Avengers later on in the comics. But he still has to learn to consider his responsibilities for stuff like school and helping around the neighborhood before pursuing something on a grand scale. Far From Home shows how Peter is having a hard time balancing his responsibilities as Spider-Man and his responsibilities to his friends, and he must learn to make his own decisions for himself. It's at this point that he must realize what kind of man and superhero he wants to be. And No Way Home shows the consequences of being Spider-Man, but also shows him embracing and accepting those consequences in order for a better future. And this is actually a theme portrayed really well in the Sam Raimi movies. But overall, I think the thing that makes Tom's Spider-Man unique is the portrayal of his growth from a boy to a man, or his growth to adulthood. And now that takes us to the event that made every true Spider-Man fan jump out of their seats in the movie theater, and that is Spider-Man No Way Home. Now, No Way Home saw the unification of all three live-action Spider-Men. Despite their differences and the different fan reactions to the different Spider-Men, it was still a moment that had every fan excited. Not only was it fan service, but the event did a great job at providing growth for all three of them, and each Spider-Man was able to shine and show what made each different version special in their own right. Spider-Man will always be an iconic character and arguably one of the most incredible superheroes of all time. And despite the differences, each live-action adaptation of the character is unique and special in its own way. And the future for the different versions are very promising. And thank you so much for watching this video.